The Spiritual Path of Karma, a non-fiction audiobook for inner awakening. Before you is a truth that does not demand belief, only awareness. Every thought you think, every word you speak, every action you take, is a seed, and every seed, without exception, returns to its source, not as punishment, not as reward, but as reflection. You are not living in a random world. You are living in a responsive one. This is the law of karma, and once you truly see it, you can never go back to sleep in the same way again. Introduction. There are moments in life when something inside you begins to question the surface of reality. You may not know when it started. Perhaps it came through heartbreak, through loss, through exhaustion, through watching the same patterns repeat again and again, despite your efforts to escape them, or perhaps it arrived quietly, in the stillness of the night, in a moment of reflection, in the strange feeling that life is trying to show you something you cannot yet fully see. Most people move through life believing events are separate, random, disconnected. They believe thoughts disappear once they are forgotten, words vanish once spoken, choices dissolve into the past. But the spiritual understanding of karma reveals something entirely different. Nothing disappears. Everything leaves an imprint. Every thought shapes the mind that thinks it. Every emotion conditions future perception. Every action plants a seed that eventually returns, not because the universe is judging you, but because consciousness naturally reflects itself. Karma is not punishment. It is continuity. It is the invisible movement between cause and consequence, unfolding across the landscape of human experience. To understand karma is to begin seeing life differently. You begin to notice how anger creates more anger, how fear recreates fearful realities, how unconscious habits become identities, how suffering repeats when awareness is absent. But you also begin to notice something else. Presence changes everything. A single moment of awareness can interrupt years of unconscious repetition. A conscious choice can alter an entire emotional direction. Compassion can dissolve cycles that resentment keeps alive. This is why karma is not a prison. It is a teacher. The purpose of this journey is not to make you fearful of your actions. It is to make you conscious of them, because awareness transforms the quality of existence itself. In this audiobook, you are not being asked to adopt a doctrine or follow a system of belief. You are being invited to observe, to look honestly at your own mind, your reactions, your relationships, your emotional patterns, your suffering, your desires, your attachments, and through that observation, to discover the deeper mechanics of inner reality. The spiritual path of karma is ultimately the path of awakening. It is the gradual realization that your inner world and outer experience are not separate forces, but interconnected expressions of consciousness in motion. As this understanding deepens, blame begins to dissolve, victimhood weakens, automatic living starts to fall away. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What is this experience revealing to me?" That question changes everything, because the moment awareness enters experience, transformation begins. This path does not require perfection. You will still make mistakes. You will still react unconsciously at times. You will still encounter pain, confusion, and uncertainty. But slowly, you begin to wake up inside your own actions. And once awareness awakens, karma no longer feels like fate. It becomes choice. So as you listen, do not simply hear these words intellectually. Allow them to become reflections. Pause when something resonates. Observe what arises within you. Notice what patterns your mind defends, what emotions it avoids, what truths it already recognizes beneath the noise. Because this journey is not merely about learning what karma is. It is about discovering how deeply your life is shaped by what you repeatedly think, feel, and become. And more importantly, how every moment contains the possibility of beginning again. Welcome to the Spiritual Path of Karma. Chapter 1. The Meaning of Karma. Karma is one of the most misunderstood spiritual ideas in human history. Some imagine it as punishment, others reduce it to luck, destiny, or cosmic revenge. But karma is far more subtle than reward and punishment. At its deepest level, karma is simply the law of inner cause and outer consequence. It is the movement of energy through consciousness. Every thought you think, every emotion you nourish, every intention you hold, and every action you take creates a ripple. That ripple does not vanish when the moment ends. It continues, Most people believe their lives are shaped primarily by external events, but karma reveals that life is shaped just as much by internal patterns. The angry mind creates an angry experience of reality. The fearful mind searches constantly for danger. The resentful heart keeps reliving the past even while moving through the present. This is karma in motion, not as superstition, but as psychological and spiritual continuity. The ancient teachings describe karma as action. But action is not limited to behavior alone. Thinking is action. Speaking is action. Avoiding truth is action. Even silence can become action when silence is used to deny what must be faced. The human being is constantly generating karma because the human mind is constantly creating momentum, and momentum becomes identity. This is why unconscious habits feel so difficult to escape. What begins as a single reaction eventually becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes personality. The personality becomes destiny. Not because destiny is fixed, but because repetition becomes powerful. A person who lives in constant judgment eventually sees flaws everywhere. A person consumed by fear slowly constructs a world that confirms fear. A person rooted in compassion begins to experience reality differently altogether. Karma is not merely what happens after action. Karma is what action turns you into. This understanding changes everything, because suddenly, spirituality is no longer about pleasing an external force. It becomes the study of consciousness itself. You begin asking deeper questions. What kind of mind am I building through repetition? What emotional patterns am I strengthening every day? What future experiences are being shaped by the way I think now? These questions are uncomfortable because they return responsibility back to awareness. And yet, within that responsibility lies freedom. If unconscious action creates suffering, then conscious action can transform it. This is why awareness is the center of all spiritual growth. Without awareness, karma repeats automatically. The same reactions create the same consequences. The same wounds recreate the same relationships. The same fears produce the same limitations. But when awareness enters the process, the cycle begins to loosen. You start noticing your anger before it controls you. You witness desire before it consumes you. You observe fear without immediately obeying it. And in that observation, something extraordinary happens. Space appears between impulse and action. That space is the beginning of freedom. Karma is not a prison sentence handed down by the universe. It is the unfolding result of unconscious or conscious participation in life. Every moment becomes a seed. Every reaction becomes a direction. Every choice becomes a continuation. The spiritual path begins the moment you realize you are not separate from the energy you create. You are living inside it. And once this truth is understood deeply, life no longer feels random. It begins to feel responsive, not controlled, not predetermined, but deeply connected to the state of your own consciousness. Chapter 2. The Illusion of Randomness. To the unconscious mind, life appears random. One person finds success with little effort. Another struggles despite sincerity and hard work. Love arrives unexpectedly for some, while others experience abandonment again and again. There are moments that seem unfair beyond explanation. Pain without warning, loss without reason, circumstances that appear chaotic and disconnected. And because the human mind longs for certainty, it often divides reality into simple categories: good luck and bad luck, fortune and misfortune, victory and failure. But the spiritual understanding of karma asks us to look deeper. What if life is not random at all? What if there are invisible patterns beneath visible events? Karma suggests that existence is not chaotic in the way it appears. Rather, it is interconnected beyond the limits of ordinary perception. The problem is not that life lacks meaning. The problem is that human awareness is usually too narrow to perceive the continuity behind experience. You see only fragments of the story, a single moment, a single consequence, a single emotional reaction. But karma unfolds across time. What you experience today may have roots in choices, patterns, fears, and intentions formed long before this moment. Some patterns are obvious. A person who lives in anger slowly damages relationships. A person who constantly avoids responsibility eventually encounters instability. A fearful mind repeatedly creates limitation by expecting danger everywhere. These karmic consequences are easy to recognize, but other patterns are subtle. A childhood wound may unconsciously shape adult relationships. An unspoken fear may quietly direct major life decisions. A belief repeated for years may become so familiar that it feels like reality itself. This is how karma often operates, silently, gradually, beneath conscious awareness. The mind sees isolated events. Consciousness sees continuity, and this continuity explains why certain experiences repeat. Different faces, different locations, different circumstances, yet the emotional pattern remains the same. The same betrayal, the same fear, the same loneliness, the same self-doubt. Life keeps presenting similar lessons until awareness evolves beyond the pattern creating them. This is not punishment, it is revelation. Existence continuously mirrors the state of consciousness back to itself. What remains unconscious repeats. What becomes conscious begins to transform. Once this is understood, victimhood begins to weaken. You stop viewing life as something merely happening to you, and begin recognizing your participation within it. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first, because it removes the illusion that change comes only from external conditions. It reveals that inner transformation is inseparable from outer experience. The quality of your consciousness influences the quality of the reality you perceive. Fear interprets life differently than peace. Resentment experiences reality differently than compassion. Attachment suffers differently than acceptance. The outer world may remain the same, yet the inner world changes everything. This is why two people can walk through identical circumstances and emerge completely different. One becomes bitter, the other becomes wise. One closes emotionally, the other awakens. The event itself is not the full story. Consciousness completes the experience. As you begin to understand karma, you start noticing that life is constantly communicating through patterns, not through punishment, not through coincidence, but through reflection. Every repeated emotional cycle contains information. Every recurring struggle points towards something unresolved. Every attachment reveals an area where awareness is still asleep, and slowly, the illusion of randomness begins to dissolve. You begin to sense that life is not a disconnected series of accidents, but an unfolding conversation between your consciousness and the reality it continuously shapes. This understanding changes the way you suffer, because instead of asking, "Why is this happening?" you begin asking, "What is this trying to teach me?" And in that question, awareness begins to awaken. Chapter 3. The Seed of Intention. Every karmic action begins long before behavior appears. It begins in intention. Before words are spoken, before choices are made, before movements enter the world, there is an invisible impulse forming within consciousness. This impulse becomes direction, and direction becomes destiny. Most people judge actions only by appearances, but karma is not concerned merely with what you do. It responds to the energy beneath why you do it. Two people may perform the exact same outward action, yet create entirely different karmic consequences. One person gives from love, another gives from the need for approval. One speaks truth to heal, another speaks truth to wound. The action may look identical on the surface, but consciousness recognizes intention at the root, because intention carries energy, and energy shapes experience. This is why karma is not mechanical. It is deeply alive. The universe does not merely record behavior like a ledger of morality. It reflects the inner state from which behavior emerges. An angry action strengthens anger. A compassionate action deepens compassion. A fearful choice reinforces fear. What you repeatedly intend, you slowly become. This is the hidden power of intention. Every thought you nourish is quietly building your future state of consciousness. Most people live unaware of this process. They believe intention is private and therefore insignificant. But nothing within consciousness is without consequence. A silent resentment affects the nervous system. An unspoken jealousy alters perception. A hidden fear changes behavior long before the mind consciously notices it. Inner energy eventually becomes outer reality. This is why spiritual traditions throughout history emphasized purity of intention above appearance, because life responds not only to actions, but to the consciousness generating them. You may deceive other people. You may even deceive yourself, but consciousness always reveals itself over time. A person driven by greed may temporarily achieve success, yet remain inwardly restless. A person motivated by compassion may struggle outwardly for a season, yet experience increasing inner peace. Karma unfolds not only through events, but through the state of being created along the way. And this is important to understand. Karma is not waiting somewhere in the future. It begins immediately. The moment anger arises unchecked, suffering has already entered the mind. The moment hatred is repeated, the heart becomes heavier. The moment compassion appears, healing already begins. Cause and effect are not always separated by time. Often they happen simultaneously within consciousness itself. This is why awareness of intention is essential on the spiritual path. Without awareness, people become prisoners of unconscious motives. They act from insecurity while calling it ambition. They control others while calling it love. They seek validation while calling it kindness. The ego is skilled at disguising intention. But spiritual growth requires honesty, not perfection. Honesty, the willingness to sit quietly and ask, why am I truly doing this? What energy is driving my choices? Am I acting from fear? Or from clarity? From ego? Or from love? These questions begin dissolving unconscious karma at its root. Because once intention becomes conscious, choice becomes possible. You no longer move automatically through emotional conditioning. You begin participating deliberately in the direction of your life. And slowly, your actions gain alignment. Your thoughts become clearer. Your relationships become more authentic. Your inner world becomes less divided. This is the transformation karma was always pointing toward. Not control over life, but responsibility within consciousness. Every intention is a seed. Some seeds create suffering, others create peace. Some strengthen illusion, others awaken truth. And whether consciously or unconsciously, you are planting these seeds every moment of your life. The spiritual path begins when you finally realize your inner world is not passive, it is creative. And what you create within eventually shapes the reality you live within. Chapter 4, Karma and Thought. Most people believe karma is created through visible action, through what is done, what is said, what can be witnessed by others. But the deepest layers of karma are often created silently, within the mind itself. Long before action enters the world, thought has already begun shaping reality. The human mind is never truly still. It constantly interprets, judges, imagines, fears, desires, remembers, and rehearses. A single thought may seem harmless, but repeated thoughts become patterns. Patterns become emotional tendencies, and emotional tendencies begin directing behavior automatically. This is how unseen karma forms. Not suddenly, but gradually. A person who repeatedly thinks fearful thoughts begins living in anticipation of danger. A mind consumed by judgment slowly loses the ability to see innocence. A person attached to resentment relives pain long after the original event has ended. The external world changes, yet the inner experience repeats itself. This is karma in thought. The mind does not merely observe reality. It participates in creating the experience of it. Two people can stand in the same room and perceive entirely different worlds because their thoughts filter reality through different emotional conditioning. One sees rejection, another sees opportunity. One sees threat, another sees growth. Thought shapes perception, and perception shapes experience. This is why unconscious thinking becomes spiritually dangerous. Most people do not choose their thoughts consciously. They inherit mental patterns from fear, memory, culture, conditioning, and emotional wounds. Then they mistake those patterns for identity. The voice in the mind becomes me. But on the spiritual path, a profound realization begins to emerge. You are not every thought you think. You are the awareness observing thought. This distinction changes everything, because the moment you observe thought without immediately believing it, karma begins to loosen its grip. Until that moment, thought controls behavior automatically. Anger appears, and action follows. Fear appears, and avoidance follows. Desire appears, and attachment follows. The cycle repeats endlessly because awareness is absent, but observation interrupts momentum. You begin noticing thoughts instead of obeying them. You witness emotional reactions instead of becoming consumed by them. You create space between consciousness and conditioning, and within that space, freedom begins. This does not mean suppressing thought. Suppression is not liberation. Hidden thoughts still shape the inner world. True transformation comes through awareness. Karma When a fearful thought arises and is fully seen, its unconscious power weakens. When resentment is observed without feeding it, the cycle begins to dissolve. When desire is witnessed clearly, attachment softens. Awareness transforms karma because awareness removes unconsciousness from the process. This is why meditation has always been central to spiritual awakening, not because silence is magical, but because silence reveals the machinery of the mind. Most people have never truly observed their own thinking. They are lost inside it, thought after thought, emotion after emotion, reaction after reaction, until identity itself becomes a collection of unconscious mental habits. But once observation deepens, you begin seeing how much suffering originates internally. Not all pain comes from the world. Much of it comes from repetitive thought patterns replayed endlessly within consciousness. The mind resurrects old wounds. It imagines future disasters. It compares constantly. It searches for validation. It creates narratives that reinforce fear and separation. And then it suffers inside the reality it helped construct. Karma in thought is subtle because it happens invisibly. No one else may hear the judgment, the resentment, the fear, or the self-hatred, but consciousness hears it. And over time, the mind becomes shaped by whatever it repeatedly entertains. This is why inner discipline matters, not rigid control, but conscious attention. To watch the mind carefully, to notice what is being strengthened daily, to recognize which thoughts create peace, and which create suffering, because every thought is planting something within you. Some thoughts imprison consciousness, others awaken it, and the spiritual path begins when you realize the quality of your inner world is shaping the quality of the life you experience. Chapter 5. The Web of Relationships. No human being exists in isolation. Every life touches another life. Every emotion moves through unseen connections. Every relationship becomes a meeting point of energies, patterns, wounds, and possibilities. This is why relationships are among the greatest teachers on the spiritual path. They reveal what solitude often hides. A person may believe they are peaceful until anger is challenged. They may believe they are healed until abandonment returns. They may believe they understand love until attachment, jealousy, or fear enters the heart. Relationships expose the unconscious, and in this way, they become karmic mirrors. Most people think relationships are formed by chance, a random meeting, a coincidence, an unexpected attraction, but karma suggests something deeper. People often enter each other's lives because there is something unresolved, unfinished, or necessary for growth within the connection. Some relationships arrive to awaken joy, others arrive to expose pain. Some bring healing, others bring confrontation, yet all of them reveal something about consciousness itself. This is why certain emotional patterns repeat across different relationships. The faces change, but the feeling remains familiar. The same fear of rejection, the same emotional distance, the same need for validation, the same attraction to what wounds you. Many people blame others for these repeating experiences without realizing they are participating in unconscious cycles carried within themselves. Karma does not simply bring people together. It brings patterns together. And until awareness enters those patterns, relationships become repetitions instead of transformations. This does not mean every painful relationship is deserved. Karma is not about blame, it is about understanding. A person who experienced neglect in childhood may unconsciously seek relationships that recreate emotional uncertainty. A person carrying deep insecurity may attract dynamics that constantly test their sense of worth. Someone afraid of intimacy may repeatedly sabotage closeness without fully understanding why. These patterns are not punishments from life. They are unresolved energies seeking awareness. And relationships become the environment where those energies surface most clearly. This is why relationships can feel spiritually intense. They awaken dormant emotions. They activate hidden fears. They expose attachments and expectations the mind did not know it carried. Love itself becomes a mirror, not only revealing what is beautiful within you, but also what remains unhealed. The spiritual purpose of relationships is not merely comfort, it is awakening. Some people enter your life briefly yet change you forever. Others remain for years, teaching lessons through presence, conflict, growth, or loss. And sometimes the deepest karmic relationships are not the easiest ones. because certain souls arrive not to complete your fantasies, but to confront your unconsciousness. This is difficult for the ego to accept. The ego wants relationships to confirm identity, to provide certainty, to avoid discomfort, but spiritual growth often emerges through discomfort, through seeing clearly how attachment creates suffering, how control destroys connection, how fear blocks intimacy, how expectation prevents genuine love. Karma within relationships is not only about what happens between two people, it is about what the relationship awakens within consciousness. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to observe yourself, to notice your reactions, your defensiveness, your need to be right, your fear of being unseen, your tendency to cling or withdraw. And through that observation, awareness begins to deepen. This is how karmic cycles transform, not by changing every person around you, but by becoming conscious within the relationship itself. When awareness enters connection, old patterns begin losing their power. You stop reacting automatically, you listen more deeply, you speak more honestly, you recognize projection instead of blaming endlessly, and slowly, relationships become less about unconscious need and more about conscious presence. This is the higher purpose of karmic connection, not possession, not dependency, not emotional control, but awakening through shared experience. Because every relationship is revealing something, the question is whether you are asleep within the pattern, or awake enough to learn from it. Chapter 6. The Weight of Unresolved Karma. What is left unresolved does not disappear, it returns, not always in the same form, not always through the same people, but through the same emotional energy seeking completion. This is the nature of unresolved karma. It repeats itself until awareness interrupts the cycle. Most people believe time alone heals pain, but time often does nothing more than bury unconscious patterns beneath distraction, routine, and survival. What remains unseen within the mind continues shaping behavior from the shadows. An unhealed betrayal becomes distrust. Unspoken grief becomes emotional numbness. Hidden shame becomes self-sabotage. Suppressed anger becomes bitterness carried quietly for years. The event may belong to the past, but the energy remains active in the present, and because it remains active, life continues reflecting it. This is why the same struggles often appear repeatedly across different stages of life. The same emotional wounds emerge through different circumstances. The same fears recreate familiar suffering. The same reactions continue producing similar consequences. A person leaves one relationship only to encounter the same dynamic again. Someone changes. Careers yet carries the same inner emptiness into every achievement. Another escapes one environment, but discovers the same anxiety following them wherever they go. The outer conditions shift, but the inner pattern survives. This is unresolved karma. It is not punishment from life. It is unconsciousness repeating itself. The mind resists this truth because the ego prefers external explanations. It blames other people, bad timing, misfortune, circumstances, and certainly, life contains genuine hardship and complexity. But spiritual awareness asks a deeper question. What within me continues participating in this cycle? That question requires courage, because it shifts attention away from blame and toward responsibility. Not responsibility as guilt, but responsibility as awareness. To become conscious of the patterns shaping your experience. Many people spend years trying to change their lives externally without examining the internal energies creating repetition, but unresolved karma travels with you. You cannot escape a pattern that lives within consciousness itself. You can change locations, relationships, jobs, identities, and appearances, yet still recreate the same suffering because the root remains untouched. This is why spiritual growth is not about avoidance. It is about confrontation through awareness. To sit honestly with what has been denied, to feel what has been suppressed, to witness the fears, attachments, and wounds without immediately turning away. This process is uncomfortable because unresolved karma carries emotional weight. The mind often avoids silence, precisely because silence reveals what distraction conceals. When external noise fades, the unfinished inner world becomes visible. Old grief surfaces, regret appears, loneliness emerges, fear speaks, and many people mistake this surfacing for failure. But in truth, it is healing beginning. What rises into awareness is no longer buried in unconsciousness. This is the sacred purpose of suffering on the spiritual path, not to destroy you, but to reveal what still seeks liberation within you. Every recurring emotional pattern is asking to be seen clearly, not judged, not suppressed, not spiritually bypassed. Seen, because awareness dissolves what unconscious repetition sustains. The moment you fully recognize a pattern, its automatic control begins weakening. You start noticing your reactions before they consume you. You recognize the familiar voice of fear before obeying it. You pause before recreating the same emotional consequences again. And within that pause, karma begins transforming. Freedom does not come from pretending the past never happened. Freedom comes from no longer allowing unconscious pain to direct the present. This is the difference between carrying karma and completing it. To carry karma is to repeat unconscious patterns endlessly. To complete karma is to become aware enough that repetition is no longer necessary. And slowly, through honesty, presence, and inner observation, the emotional weight you carried for years begins to loosen, not because life erased the past, but because awareness changed your relationship to it. This is how unresolved karma finally begins to release, not through force, but through consciousness becoming awake, enough to stop repeating what no longer needs to continue. Chapter 7. The Power of Conscious Action. Most human action is not truly conscious. It is reaction. A person feels anger and immediately speaks. They feel fear and immediately withdraw. They feel desire and immediately pursue. They feel discomfort and immediately escape. The vast majority of behavior is driven by unconscious momentum, accumulated over years of conditioning. This is how karma sustains itself, not through dramatic events alone, but through automatic repetition happening moment after moment. The same thoughts produce the same emotions. The same emotions produce the same reactions. The same reactions produce the same consequences. And slowly, people begin calling this cycle who they are. But consciousness offers another possibility, the possibility of action without unconscious reaction. This is the beginning of karmic transformation. Conscious action does not mean perfect behavior. It means awareness entering the space before choice. That space changes everything, because when awareness is present, you are no longer completely controlled by emotional momentum. You begin noticing anger before it becomes destruction. You recognize fear before it becomes paralysis. You observe attachment before it becomes suffering. And in that observation, a different response becomes possible. This is true spiritual power, not control over others, not domination of circumstances, but mastery of inner participation. A conscious person still experiences emotion, still experiences pain, still encounters difficulty, but they are no longer entirely possessed by what they feel. Instead of reacting automatically, they pause, and within that pause, awareness interrupts karma. This interruption may seem small, but it changes the direction of consciousness itself. A single conscious response can dissolve years of unconscious repetition. One moment of honesty can heal layers of self-deception. One act of forgiveness can end cycles of resentment. One decision made from clarity instead of fear can alter the course of an entire life. This is why conscious action carries extraordinary spiritual significance. It weakens the grip of the past. Most people are not living freely. They are reliving psychological patterns formed long ago. Their reactions are conditioned by memory, fear, wounds, social programming, and emotional survival mechanisms. They believe they are choosing, while often they are simply repeating. But awareness reveals the difference between reaction and response. Reaction is unconscious. Response is conscious. Reaction is immediate. Response is observed. Reaction comes from conditioning. Response comes from presence. This is why spiritual traditions throughout history emphasized mindfulness, self-observation, and inner stillness, not as rituals for comfort, but as practices for awakening consciousness out of automatic living. Because without awareness, karma continues endlessly. The same emotional patterns recreate themselves through different circumstances. The same unconscious impulses shape future suffering. But when consciousness becomes present, a new possibility emerges. You stop asking, "How do I control life?" and begin asking, "How do I participate in life consciously?" That question transforms the spiritual path, because true freedom does not come from controlling external reality. It comes from no longer being enslaved by unconscious inner reactions. A conscious person understands that every moment contains creative power. Every interaction, every word, every decision, every silence, each moment is either strengthening unconsciousness or strengthening awareness. This understanding naturally changes the way you live. You begin speaking more carefully because you recognize the energy words carry. You begin listening more deeply because presence becomes more valuable than being right. You begin observing your emotional states without immediately projecting them onto others. And gradually, your life becomes less reactive and more intentional. This is how karma evolves, not through force, not through fear, but through awareness transforming the quality of action itself. When consciousness enters action fully, the past loses its automatic authority over the present. You are no longer merely repeating inherited patterns. You are creating consciously, and this is where spiritual maturity begins. Not when life becomes perfect, but when awareness becomes stronger than unconscious momentum. Because the moment you act consciously, you step out of mechanical repetition and enter the possibility of freedom. Chapter 8: Karma and Suffering. Few experiences shape human life more deeply than suffering. Every person, regardless of status, belief, or achievement, eventually encounters pain, loss, disappointment, loneliness, fear, grief, failure, emotional wounds that seem impossible to explain. And when suffering arrives, the mind immediately asks the same question: why? Why did this happen? Why now? Why me? Most people see suffering as interruption, as evidence that life has gone wrong. But the spiritual understanding of karma offers a different perspective. Suffering is not always meaningless. Often, it is revelation. It is consciousness being forced to confront what it has avoided, denied, or remain unconscious of. Pain has a unique power. It breaks illusion. As long as life remains comfortable, many people continue living unconsciously, repeating habits, ignoring inner conflict, avoiding deeper questions. But suffering interrupts the trance. It exposes attachment. It reveals fear. It uncovers dependency. It forces hidden wounds into awareness. This is why pain, though difficult, can become spiritually transformative. Not because suffering itself is holy, but because awareness often awakens through it. Karma and suffering are deeply connected because suffering frequently emerges from unconscious patterns. Attachment creates fear of loss. Control creates anxiety. Resentment creates inner poison. Constant comparison creates emptiness. The mind generates suffering through the way it relates to experience. Two people may encounter the same external event, yet suffer very differently. One resists reality completely. The other accepts, learns, and transforms. The difference is not always the event itself. It is consciousness. This does not mean all suffering is self-created. Life contains genuine tragedy, illness, loss, injustice, experiences no philosophy can simplify. But karma suggests that suffering becomes intensified when unconsciousness shapes our response to pain. The mind clings, fights, blames, identifies completely with the wound, and in doing so, suffering deepens beyond the original event. A painful moment becomes a permanent identity. This is why unresolved suffering repeats itself internally long after circumstances change. The event ends, but the psychological attachment remains alive within consciousness. A person betrayed years ago may still live in distress. Someone rejected in childhood may still carry feelings of unworthiness decades later. An old humiliation may continue shaping self-image far into adulthood. The external pain belonged to the past, but karma continues through identification with it. This is one of the deepest spiritual truths. Pain is inevitable, but unconscious suffering is often sustained through resistance and attachment. Awareness changes this relationship completely. When pain is observed consciously, without denial and without total identification, something begins to soften. You stop becoming the pain. You begin witnessing it. This does not erase grief or difficulty overnight. It does not remove human emotion. But awareness creates space around suffering, and within that space, wisdom emerges. You begin seeing what pain was revealing. Perhaps suffering exposed attachment disguised as love. Perhaps it revealed fear hidden beneath ambition. Perhaps it uncovered emotional wounds, long ignored, beneath distraction and achievement. Suffering often reveals the unconscious structures governing life, and once seen clearly, those structures begin losing power. This is why many spiritual awakenings begin during periods of difficulty, not because pain is superior to joy, but because suffering strips away illusion. It humbles the ego, it weakens false certainty, it forces deeper questions into consciousness. Questions comfort rarely asks: who am I beneath my roles and achievements? What am I truly seeking? Why do certain patterns repeat? What within me remains unhealed? These questions open the door to transformation, because suffering, when met consciously, becomes more than pain. It becomes instruction, not punishment from the universe, but feedback from consciousness itself, a signal that something within requires attention, understanding, or awakening. And slowly, through awareness, the relationship with suffering changes. You stop asking only how to escape pain, and begin asking how to understand it. That shift marks the beginning of spiritual maturity, because karma is not trying to destroy you through suffering, it is trying to awaken you through awareness. Chapter 9: Liberation from Karma. Many people misunderstand spiritual liberation. They imagine it as escape from pain, escape from difficulty, escape from human emotion and responsibility. But liberation from karma is not the disappearance of life. It is the disappearance of unconscious bondage within life. The awakened person still experiences the world. They still feel joy and grief. They still encounter challenge, uncertainty, and change. But something fundamental has shifted. They are no longer completely identified with the movements of the mind. This is the essence of liberation. Most human beings live inside unconscious momentum. Thoughts arise, and they become the thoughts. Emotions appear, and they become the emotions. Fear enters, and life begins revolving around fear. Desire appears, and identity becomes attached to desire. The mind pulls consciousness endlessly between memory and anticipation, regret and anxiety, attachment and resistance, and this constant psychological movement creates karmic continuity, not because life demands suffering, but because unconscious identification keeps recreating it. Liberation begins the moment awareness separates itself from automatic identification. You still experience thought, but you are no longer trapped inside every thought. You still experience emotion, but emotions no longer completely control perception and action. This inner shift changes the entire relationship with karma. Before awareness, every reaction strengthens conditioning. Anger creates more anger. Fear creates more fear. Attachment creates more suffering. But when consciousness becomes deeply present, reaction begins dissolving before it hardens into karmic momentum. This is freedom, not freedom from life, but freedom within consciousness itself. The spiritual traditions often describe this state as awakening, not because the world disappears, but because illusion weakens. You begin seeing clearly how much suffering was created through unconscious attachment, attachment to identity, attachment to being right, attachment to approval, attachment to control, attachment to the stories the mind constantly repeats. And as awareness deepens, these attachments begin loosening naturally, not through force, but through understanding. You realize that clinging creates suffering, resistance creates suffering, identification creates suffering. The ego survives by constantly reinforcing a fixed sense of self. My success, my failure, my pain, my image, my story. But liberation reveals something beyond this constructed identity. There is awareness beneath the personality, stillness beneath thought, presence beneath fear. And when consciousness rests more deeply in awareness itself, karma loses its ability to bind completely. Actions still occur, but they no longer strengthen the illusion of a separate, fearful self in the same way. You begin acting with clarity rather than compulsion, speaking with awareness rather than reaction, living with presence rather than unconscious momentum. This does not make a person passive. In fact, true awareness often creates more compassionate and authentic action. Because when ego weakens, fear weakens with it. And when fear weakens, love becomes less conditional. You stop trying to control every outcome. You stop fighting reality constantly. You stop carrying every emotional wound as permanent identity. Instead, you begin flowing with life consciously. This is why liberation is not detachment from humanity. It is freedom from unconsciousness. The liberated person still participates fully in life, but inwardly they are no longer imprisoned by every passing thought, emotion, or desire. There is space within them, stillness, clarity, and from that clarity, a different way of living emerges, one no longer driven entirely by the past, one no longer trapped in endless psychological repetition, one no longer seeking completion through external conditions alone. This is the deeper meaning of freedom on the karmic path, not becoming perfect, not escaping the world, but awakening from mechanical living. The mind may still produce thoughts, the world may still bring challenge, but awareness no longer falls asleep inside every experience. And in that awakened state, karma changes completely, because karma binds only the unconscious. The moment consciousness becomes fully present, the cycle begins to dissolve, and what remains is not emptiness. What remains is peace. Chapter 10. Living the Karmic Path. To live with karmic awareness is not to withdraw from life. It is to enter life more fully. While no longer moving through it unconsciously, every moment becomes significant again, not because fear has returned, but because awareness has awakened. In ordinary living, people often move through their days on autopilot. Thought leads to reaction. Emotion leads to impulse. Habit leads to repetition. The present moment is rarely met directly. It is filtered through memory, expectation, and unconscious conditioning. But when karmic awareness deepens, something subtle begins to change. You start noticing the inner movement before it becomes action. You observe the thought before it becomes identity. You feel the emotion before it becomes behavior. You recognize the pattern before it repeats itself again. And in that recognition, choice returns, not the illusion of control over everything, but the simple, profound ability to respond consciously instead of react unconsciously. This is how the karmic path is lived, not through perfection, but through presence. There will still be moments of unconscious reaction. Old patterns will still surface. Emotions will still arise unexpectedly, but awareness begins shortening the distance between impulse and recognition. And over time, that distance becomes space. Space to see, space to pause, space to choose differently. This is where transformation lives. To live karmically aware means to take full responsibility for your inner world, without becoming harsh toward yourself. Responsibility without self-punishment. Awareness without judgment. Clarity without spiritual superiority. You begin observing patterns honestly. How certain thoughts repeatedly create suffering. How certain emotional habits shape relationships. How certain fears quietly guide decisions. How certain attachments influence perception. And instead of resisting these discoveries, you begin understanding them, because understanding dissolves unconscious repetition. The karmic path is not about controlling every outcome of life. Life will always remain dynamic, unpredictable, and beyond complete control. But your participation in it becomes conscious. You stop adding unnecessary suffering through unconscious reaction. You stop reinforcing patterns that no longer serve growth. You stop identifying completely with every passing mental state. And slowly, life becomes less reactive and more awake. This does not mean challenges disappear. Challenges are part of existence, but your relationship with them changes. You begin meeting difficulty with awareness instead of collapse. You begin meeting uncertainty with presence instead of fear. You begin meeting others with understanding instead of projection. And this changes the quality of experience itself. Karma is no longer something dragging you through repetition. It becomes something you are consciously engaging with and transforming. Each moment becomes an opportunity to observe, to respond, to realign, to awaken a little more fully. Even simple actions begin to carry new depth. Speaking becomes more intentional. Listening becomes more present. Thinking becomes more observed. Silence becomes more meaningful. Life itself becomes a practice of awareness. And over time, you begin to see that nothing is wasted. Every experience carries information. Every emotion reveals something about consciousness. Every relationship reflects something within you. Every challenge exposes something ready to be seen. Nothing is separate from the path. This is what it means to live karmically, not escaping the world, but seeing through it clearly, not avoiding experience, but meeting it consciously, not trying to become someone new, but awakening to what has always been aware beneath all becoming. And in that awakening, life no longer feels like something happening to you. It feels like something moving through you, with increasing clarity, presence, and understanding. This is the living path of karma, and it is always available, not in a distant future, but in this very moment. Conclusion: the returning to awareness. In the end, karma was never separate from you. It was never an external system watching, judging, or rewarding your actions from a distance. It was always closer than that. It was the movement of your own consciousness expressing itself through thought, intention, emotion, and action, then returning as experience. What you called life happening to you was always life responding through you, and what you called destiny was often the continuation of unconscious patterns repeating themselves until they were seen clearly enough to dissolve. This is the quiet truth that runs beneath everything explored in this journey. Karma is not something you escape. It is something you understand so deeply that its unconscious grip begins to loosen, because what is seen clearly no longer controls you in the same way. For most of life, human beings move through cycles without noticing them, the same emotional reactions, the same relational dynamics, the same inner conflicts appearing in different forms, not because life is repeating itself externally, but because consciousness is repeating itself internally, and until awareness enters that repetition, it continues. This is why awakening is not about changing the world first. It is about seeing the world clearly through the lens of your own participation in it. When awareness deepens, something subtle but profound begins to shift. You stop identifying completely with every thought. You stop being carried entirely by every emotion. You stop reacting automatically to every inner impulse. And slowly, space appears. In that space, karma loses its unconscious force, not because life becomes controlled, but because you are no longer entirely unconscious within it. You begin to notice patterns instead of being trapped inside them. You begin to witness emotions instead of being consumed by them. You begin to respond instead of repeating. And this changes everything, because the cycle of unconscious karma depends on identification. Without awareness, thought becomes identity, emotion becomes reality, reaction becomes destiny. But with awareness, a new possibility opens. You are no longer only the stream of experience, you are the awareness in which the stream appears. This realization does not remove life's challenges. It does not erase pain, uncertainty, or change, but it transforms your relationship to them. Suffering no longer defines you in the same way. Fear no longer governs you completely. The past no longer dictates every response. You begin to live with presence rather than compulsion. And in that presence, something deeper than control emerges. Clarity. Clarity to see what is actually happening within you. Clarity to recognize patterns without denial. Clarity to meet life without the constant distortion of unconscious conditioning. This clarity is the beginning of freedom, not freedom from life, but freedom within awareness itself. Karma, once understood, is no longer something to fear. It becomes a language, a way of seeing how consciousness shapes experience, and how experience, in turn, reveals consciousness. Every moment becomes meaningful again, not because it is perfect, but because it is alive with insight. Nothing is wasted. Every thought shows you the mind. Every emotion shows you the heart. Every relationship reflects something within you. Every challenge reveals what is still unconscious. And through this continuous reflection, awakening unfolds naturally, not as a sudden escape, but as a gradual return. A return to awareness, a return to presence, a return to what has always been here beneath the movement of thought, memory, and identity. So as this journey concludes, there is nothing to fix and nothing to escape, only awareness to recognize. Because in the end, the spiritual path of karma is not about becoming someone new. It is about seeing clearly enough to stop being lost in what was never separate from you in the first place. And in that seeing, life becomes not a burden of repetition, but a living unfolding of consciousness, moment by moment, returning you to awareness again and again.